In a wide-ranging interview with the New York Times, Donald Trump has said international law will not restrain him. But don't worry, something else will.
Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing. My own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop. And,
Not international
and that's
law.
very good. I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people.
Ash, welcome to the show. Governing the relationships between nation states, we could either have international law or we could have Donald Trump's morality. Which would you prefer?
So on the one hand, we have international law, not perfect, obviously. The mechanisms for enforcing it, very weak, particularly when it comes to great powers. And on the other hand, we have the clearly flawless morality of a man who's been found liable for the sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll, who has been tied up in, I think, hundreds of lawsuits by contractors that he failed to pay. A former friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who may have sent a lewd birthday card with, kind of the outline of a naked woman. Someone who calls female reporters piggy when he wants them to shut up. Somebody who has authorized the kidnapping of a president in the region, in Nicolas Maduro. Somebody who has no regard for the sovereignty of other states. I don't know, man. I think we should give this Donald Trump morality a try, seeing as we're in the era where, international law has seemingly come to an end.
Let's listen to a bit more of that exchange.
Do you feel your administration needs to abide by international law on the global stage?
Yeah, I do. I do. But it depends what your definition of international law is. You mean in Greenland?
That's
because you needed them at the time.
In the 1951 agreement, though, it says the United States can reopen these bases anytime you want. You can send as many troops as you want, and you haven't done it. How come?
Because I want to do it properly.
And properly means own it?
Really, it is. To me, it's ownership. Ownership is very important.
Why is ownership important here?
Because that's what I feel is psychologically needed for success. I think that ownership gives you a thing that you can't do, whether you're talking about a lease or a treaty. Ownership gives you things and elements that you can't get from just signing a document that you can have a base.
So we could go into the psychology of this. Donald Trump saying he just really wants to own it, even if sort of all the functions of security could be achieved without owning it. He's just in this island and he wants it to be his. I suppose on a more serious level, though, on a more sort of significant level, is this a real shift in how America exercises power? Because I suppose one way that you could distinguish the American empire from, say, the British Empire or the French Empire or even the Roman Empire is that those were all empires where, the core wanted to have direct governing control over the peripheries. And the United States has seemed to be able to maintain what many people would call an empire without doing that. Obviously, if you go too far in a certain direction, you might get cooed by the United States. But to be sort of within America's sphere of influence, they've normally allowed countries to be relatively independent, right? To be sovereign nation states, not just part of the American government system. Or, I think you can argue that Europe is within America's empire, but we're not owned by America. But now we seem to be going back to something a bit more like the British Empire, where Donald Trump looks at a country and says, I want to govern that country.
I don't know if you've seen this theory from Adam Tooze, which is, half in jest, but also might not be, which is this idea that maybe Donald Trump's theory of geopolitics has been generated from playing Risk. Because if you play Risk, I think as North America, you have to have control of Venezuela, Canada, and Greenland in order to win. And so those are clearly all things that he said he wants to do. Sort of floated this idea of annexing Canada, wants to either purchase or invade Greenland, maybe, and has already cooed Maduro and has said he wants control of the oil. So that's something which you can't exactly dismiss. I mean, I wrote about this in this morning's Cortado, which I know you are an avid reader of, Michael, where I was trying to get to grips with what is genuinely new about Trump's doctrine and what is kind of old and a continuation. And I think that what we've seen, particularly in this past week, is what you get when you sort of marry the, ineffable idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump as a personality with some long-standing strategic objectives of quite established neoconservatives. So, for instance, the kidnapping of Maduro, that has been a long-standing objective of neocons. Why does Trump do it at the time that he does it? There are all sorts of takes on why. One is the idea that he thought that Maduro wasn't taking negotiations seriously enough. Another is that he just always wanted to do it and it happened to be now. Another is that it would take attention away from the Epstein list, whatever, right? But what you have there is like quite a long-standing objective coupled with something that's gone in Donald Trump's brain that we probably will never fully understand. I think when it comes to Greenland and saying, okay, well, it may be a choice between preserving, the NATO alliance or me having this thing that I want, that is something that's fairly new, and I'll tell you why. America has always been selective about what international treaties it does or does not sign up to or ratify. I mean, I cited the Rome Statute, which establishes the International Criminal Court and its jurisdiction. America has never been a signatory to the Rome Statute. That's something which is quite long-standing, and that's sort of, America's relationship to international law in a nutshell. We want it to bind other countries, but not us. What's a little bit different about Donald Trump, and you saw this with the unilateral exit from the Iranian nuclear deal in 2018, is that I think he considers any kind of agreement before a profound show of force to be essentially chickening out, right? Why do we sign up to this? It's a bad deal. Could have gotten a better deal. There's always more to squeeze them. So I think that his preference is for negotiations and deal making to take place after he's had the chance to throttle the person or the party that's sat opposite, at the negotiating table. And I kind of think that that's maybe where Greenland sits. Is Donald Trump willing to completely implode NATO? Maybe part of his judgment is that, well, actually European powers need to be sort of underpinned and undergirded by American military might more than they need, Denmark to be within the fraternity of nations. That might be a part of the calculation he's making. Or he's thinking, all right, there's a show of force and then I get some kind of sweetheart deal on minerals, right? That might be a thing that he's thinking. But I do think that is something which is sort of genuinely new in the sort of like evolution of, American geopolitics, is this thing which I think is an aspect of Trump and sort of comes from his experience in business, which is first I'll choke you and then we'll talk.
And I wanted to talk about the broader issue of international law. So Donald Trump there saying, well, I mean, he does later in the interview, in that clip we showed you, sort of say, oh, actually, I do follow international law. It just depends on your definition, which obviously just leaves it very open. I suppose the definition being he agrees with it when he follows international law, when he agrees with it, and he doesn't when he doesn't. This whole thing, so I suppose starting with the kidnapping of Maduro, has sparked, I think, quite an interesting debate about international law, whether it matters. There's obviously for a long time been a critique on the left and also the right, sort of a realist critique it would be called, whereby international law is basically just seen as fairly meaningless, as a tool for imperialism, as ideology, essentially, whereby strong states, I suppose, hide the imperial nature of their relationships with other states behind liberal niceties. And so some people look at Donald Trump and they say, look, there isn't actually anything new here beyond finally there's a president who's honest about what they're doing. So the argument would be that many presidents would have behaved in a very similar way to Donald Trump, but they would just have dressed up their motives in a different way. They wouldn't have explicitly said this is about oil or because I want to own that island. They would have said it's because of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. They would have tried to fit it within liberal norms. As I say, this has prompted, I think, an interesting debate this week. I want to show one tweet that got quite a lot of traction from economist and writer Dominic Lersder. I hope I've pronounced his second name correctly. He tweets under the name New Left E-Views. So he said, the argument against international law on the basis that it is hard to enforce and a vehicle for great power interests is superficially plausible, but intellectually bankrupt. There is a collective virtue in hypocrisy if it involves us forcing each other to use a language with which we can try to create accountability in the long run and which is necessary to organise opposition before and after the fact. It is an important basis for winning power and thus for social transformation in general. The world that is emerging now is just the kind of world you get when you insist on vulgar realism. On the left, it is indicative of us not having any serious theory of geopolitics. Ash, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, we've been talking about international law a lot in the context of Gaza. You did a long interview with Kenneth Roth last year on the topic of international law. Do you think for all that people on the left have criticised international law, we might miss it when it's completely gone, so it's already not as strong as people might like to make out. Major powers get to choose as and when they follow it. But if we end up now with a generation of politicians who just say, screw it, I'm doing this because I want to, are we going to miss the days when they used to at least have to come up with a justification for what they do?
Do you know something, Michael? I was looking through today's script and I saw this question and I was like, bloody hell, it's like such a deep question about political philosophy. And the most honest answer I can give you is I'm not entirely sure what I think. I'm, like lots of other people, trying to work out what I think. And I can give you sort of the coordinates of the different starting points which exist in my brain, but I don't think I've got a conclusion where I can say definitively, yes, international law is an important fiction and it's something to which we aspire and it becomes a language through which politics is contested in a useful way. Or no, it was a way of sort of obscuring the extractive and oppressive relationships between the global north and the global south. I don't know what I think definitively either side, so that might be very disappointing for people. I mean, in terms of like describing where we are now, I was doing a little bit of research in order to prepare for answering this question, and I found a really interesting article by a guy called Nicholas Rakovich, and one of the things that he says in his description of this period that we seem to have entered is that it's the rule of guns and lawyers. And there is this fantastic quote from his piece where he says, international law has not vanished, but it no longer sets the limits of great power conduct. It is being displaced by legality, rules as instruments, not restraints. So this thing about legality rather than a restraint and the rule of guns and lawyers, it's sort of like trying to tie up your opponent in lawsuits and legalism. So it's an instrument by which you gain an advantage or impose a disadvantage, but it's not actually a moral framework at all. And I think that once more describes Trump's approach to politics very, very well. In terms of whether or not you're going to entirely throw out international law, I mean, look, I think that there has been some ways in which international law has been a useful and impactful framework. I think that its impact on conventional weaponry in warfare, with some exceptions, has been transformational. So you think about things like, landmines and use of poison gas and biological agents and things like that. International law has been hugely, hugely impactful. I think maybe the thing that's missed out by, it's a virtuous hypocrisy, right? It gives us a framework for accountability, is that one of the things that it perhaps misses out is the sort of material conditions in which this language game takes place. And I think that this is something which is missed out by lots of people. So what are the constraints on American power after the Cold War? What were the constraints on Russian power after the Cold War? These are things which really matter for when you're thinking about what are these countries going to do and why. I think that there's another part of the picture which is really important, which is, we talked about it in our interview roundup, myself and our colleague Aaron Bastani, which is this really uneven model of nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament. So countries like Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons on the understanding that there would be certain security guarantees. What guarantees existed clearly were not enough to prevent Russia invading Ukrainian sovereign territory. And I think that there are arguments in favor of the idea that, okay, well, if Ukraine had never given up its nuclear stockpile, maybe you wouldn't have seen the invasion by Russia. There are certainly people in Iran who will be thinking, well, Israel and America would never have attacked us if we actually had the bomb. And maybe those years sort of, slowing down the process of uranium enrichment and, playing nice by signing up to this treaty, what that did was stop us from developing this capability, which is really essential to our survival as a nation. So I think that international law is a means of accountability and a means of contesting politics. It doesn't exist separately from those conditions. So I'm not advocating a sort of vulgar realism, but a little bit of vulgar realism maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dominic Lasda, from following him on Twitter, would probably say he also takes into account the material power dynamics. But obviously, you're commenting on this particular tweet. The thing that stood out to me that I liked about this, and this is something I've been thinking about in many contexts, is how hypocrisy is not the worst thing in the world. Because hypocrisy in some ways is, obviously this would be a very idealistic way of talking about international relations, but on an individual level, it's sometimes you trying to hold yourself to a higher standard than which is actually possible. And I think one reason why it's the right-wing tabloids that are so obsessed with hypocrisy, a climate campaigner who then takes a plane, or, someone who's against animal cruelty and then eats a burger, all this stuff. And it's not because they want people to hold themselves to the highest standards. It's because the alternative is a kind of moral nihilism where you just say, well, you should just be able to do what you want. And if people just do exactly what they want, then might makes right. So I think the opposite of hypocrisy isn't necessarily moral purity. It's like amoralism. And I think that applies to many parts of life and politics. I don't know, your final thoughts on that, Ash, before we move to our final story?
Sometimes I feel like we're two horses in one harness, Michael, because as you were talking, before you said the thing about, right-wing commentators, I wrote down hypocrisy is a charge you can only level at people who are trying to do something. Because this is something which I have been thinking for a long time, which is why is it hypocrisy is the preferred charge offered by, Julia Hartley-Brewer on one side or Piers Morgan on the other. It's because it's something which you can only throw at someone who is aspiring to be better than they are or trying to make the world better than it currently is. You can only level it as a charge against people who are trying to do something that they see in some way as good. And I think that the charge of hypocrisy, it's coming from an emotional place that I think we all have, but is like kind of a bad one, where someone trying to do something sort of throws our own inadequacy or lack of moral backbone or integrity into sharp relief. And so rather than being put in touch with, well, actually, could I be doing more than I currently am, and having an interrogative relationship to that feeling, instead you sort of do the Uno reverse back to you and be like, oh, you make me feel shit about myself here. Let me make you feel shit by calling you a hypocrite.